All right, you've probably heard that old saying, right? That the US and the UK are two nations separated by a common language. Well, today, we're going to dig into that because the differences are way deeper and honestly, way more hilarious than just a few words. So, let's get into it.
I mean, have you ever been on vacation and confidently ordered chips only to get a plate of French fries? Or you ask for a soda and you get, well, just sparkling water. These little mix-ups, they're really just the tip of the iceberg. They point to some much bigger and honestly pretty surprising cultural divides.
Okay, so let's start with a truly sacred institution on both sides of the pond, the place you go for a drink. But as you're about to see, what happens in a pub versus what happens in a bar can be like two different worlds. Let's kick things off with the temperature of a beer. Simple, right? Not so fast. In the USA, beer is pretty much always served ice cold, almost freezing. But in the UK and other Commonwealth countries, things like ales and bitters are served at cellar temperature, which is much warmer. The idea is it brings out the flavor. Now, to an American, that might just taste warm and flat. But to a Brit, an ice-cold beer is, well, the source we're looking at calls it tasteless or even foul.
And this whole cold versus warm thing doesn't stop with beer. Americans, we love our ice. Order a soft drink in the States, and that glass is going to be at least half, maybe 3/4 full of ice before they even pour the drink. And there's a reason for this. It actually goes back to the 1800s when America became a giant in the ice harvesting industry. Ice was suddenly cheap and everywhere. Meanwhile, in the Commonwealth, yeah, you might get a cube. Maybe two. It's a totally different philosophy.
And check this out. This quote just perfectly nails one of the most shocking differences. A beer with lunch during the work week in America, you could literally get fired, like on the spot. But in the Commonwealth, heading to the pub for lunch and a couple of beers isn't just normal, it can actually be a way for the boss to bond with the team. How wild is that?
Okay, so let's move from the bar to the dinner table, because the rules and traditions around eating, well, it's a whole other minefield of potential slip-ups.
So let's talk about just using a fork and a knife. In the US, there's this move called the cut and switch. You cut your food with your knife, you put the knife down, then you switch your fork over to your dominant hand to take a bite. But in the Commonwealth, it's a totally different dance. The knife stays in your right hand, the fork stays in your left the entire time. To an American, it can look a little complicated.
And speaking of cutlery, you are not going to believe this. The classic American hamburger, a food literally designed to be eaten with your hands, is sometimes eaten with a knife and fork in some Commonwealth countries. They might even just toss the top bun. It's this incredible clash of super casual food and very formal table manners.
The whole vibe of eating out is different too. In America, it's often about speed. Get in, eat, pay, get out. An average visit might be 45 minutes to an hour? But in the Commonwealth, dinner is the event. Staying for 4, 5, even 6 hours isn't weird at all, and the staff will never bring you the check until you specifically ask for it. The meal isn't a pit stop, it's the whole point of the evening.
All right, let's pivot to the language itself, the thing that's supposed to unite everyone. But between the spelling, the slang, and how things are pronounced, it can feel like a linguistic battlefield out there.
So, first up, the classic, the letter U. In the Commonwealth, you get words like color with a U, harbor with a U. In the USA, that U is just gone. And this wasn't an accident. It was mostly thanks to a guy named Noah Webster, yeah, the dictionary guy, who, way back in the day, decided to simplify American spelling to make it distinct from British English.
Here's another big one you see everywhere, the S versus the Z. Realize in the Commonwealth becomes realize in the US. Organization turns into organization. It's a tiny change, but it happens in hundreds and hundreds of words.
And then there's my favorite, the great flip-flop. Words that end in RE in the Commonwealth get switched to ER in America. So center becomes center, theater becomes theater, and once you start noticing these patterns, you really can't unsee them.
Now moving on from spelling to slang, this is where things get really fun. So after a super long day, an American might say, "Ugh, I'm beat," but someone from the UK, they'd say they're absolutely knackered. Same feeling, but knackered, it just sounds like a whole other level of tired, doesn't it?
Or how about what you call a friend? In the US, it could be your buddy, your pal, your dude. But in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, there's one word that just rules them all. For friends, and even for friendly strangers, mate. It's just packed with this easygoing, friendly vibe.
And when something goes wrong, an American is bummed out. But in the UK, they're gutted. It's so much more visceral, It really shows how language evolves. Bummed out is a disappointment. Gutted feels like you just took a punch to the stomach.
All right, for our last section, let's talk about the invisible stuff. These are the unwritten rules, the social codes that can trip you up the most because nobody ever actually explains them to you.
So in the USA, tipping at a restaurant isn't just a nice thing to do, it's a huge part of how servers make their living. 15% is pretty much the bare minimum standard, and 20% is more and more common for good service. If you don't tip, it's a really big deal.
Now, let's compare that to the Commonwealth. A 10% tip is often seen as pretty generous, and in a lot of places, it's not really expected at all. And that's because the whole economic system is different. Servers' wages there aren't nearly as dependent on customer tips.
This one is a really deep look into a cultural mindset. In America, you can get a perfect score, a perfect 10 in gymnastics. Perfection is a real, achievable thing. But in a lot of Commonwealth cultures, the whole way of thinking is that you can never be truly perfect. There's always room to get better. So the absolute highest score you might ever see awarded is a 9.9.
And the list of these everyday differences just keeps on going. Which side of the road do you drive on? Right versus left? How do you measure temperature? Fahrenheit versus Celsius? What about the electricity coming out of the wall? 110 volts versus 240? And trust me, that's a mistake you only make once with your electronics. Even the big summer sports, the steady rhythm of baseball versus the epic, sometimes multi-day saga of cricket, they're just worlds apart.
So when you put it all together, you realize these aren't just funny little quirks. Each and every one of these differences, from how cold your beer is to how you spell a word, it's like a little clue. It's a tiny window into different histories, different values, and just completely different ways of looking at the world.
And it kind of leaves you with this one big question to chew on. If all these little habits and words are just what's on the surface, what are the really deep currents underneath that make a culture what it is? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.